and we'll introduce that next speaker now. We mentioned that there were a couple of themes that we were going to think about. The decade of centenaries we've just talked about in some detail. That I think you will all agree was a fascinating panel and drew in some of the themes that we began to sketch on Friday evening. But one of the other themes alongside the decade of centenaries that we wanted to think about this weekend was Ireland in the 18th century, Munster and its connections to a wider Atlantic world, and a wider world of commerce and of mercantile connections. There are many aspects to that, and our next speaker, Professor David Dickson, Professor Emeritus in European History at Trinity, is one of the authorities in this area. He'll be known to many for his fantastic work, Old World Colony, on the economy and society of Munster. And that includes one of the other strands that we're going to discuss later today in relation to Ireland and wine, and in particular the manufacture, trade and consumption of the products of Bordeaux. But there are other strands to that Munster mercantile connection and that Atlantic reality, and some of them are much darker and more tragic. And I suspect it's on those that David is going to begin to enlighten us in the next talk, which he's entitled Cork City, the Caribbean and Complicity. David.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Victoria and Simon, for the invitation to put myself in the firing line, because what I want to talk about is a difficult and to some extent really under-researched topic. We've just had a splendid panel session on areas of Irish history which are certainly been the subject of a collective of attention over the last 10 plus years, whereas what I want to talk about is, certainly been looked at, but in a much more sketchy, fragmentary way. And I think it's really more a question of things we don't know than things we do. Is the screen working there? Yeah, grand. So I suppose a good place to start is not Cork, but Bristol. And we have, in that image from last year in Broadwalk, absence and presence. A noted absence, well, you have a plinth, but nobody on the plinth, because that was where Edward Colston's statue stood before its defenestration, so to speak. A leading figure in the Royal African Company, James II's great enterprise. Important to remember his association with it. And Colston, the Bristol merchant, Londoner as well, and somebody who was very much certainly associated with, if you like, the politics behind the slave trade, if not so much a person who knew the African coast. It's important, just as a quick footnote, to notice where we are today in Atlantic West Cork, to notice that the Royal Africa Company's ships did occasionally touch in an unplanned way the coast of West Cork. Most famously, of course, the wreck of the Amity, lost here near Seven Heads in 1701, with hardwoods and ivory from West Africa, a shipwreck that, in a sense, has been giving ever since the last 300 years, at least in story, if not in substance, to West Cork. But that's unfortunately has to be by the way, the wreck of the Amity. But through the trees there in that image, you can see, I think, Edmund Burke, the partly reared parliamentary statesman, philosopher, 2 generations younger than Colston, who had, for some years, was the MP for Bristol, and in that capacity, was lobbyist for the West India merchants in Westminster Parliament, very much, if you like, an advocate of facilitating the sugar trade. And yet the same Edmund Burke was of course, an abolitionist in the late 1780s, after he'd been MP for Bristol, and stayed that way for some years before events in France somewhat changed his position. But Burke's role on slavery and the slave trade is much more complicated and some would say still somewhat incriminating. But those such thoughts were not in the minds of those great Bristolian conservatives of the Victorian era who put up the statue, first of Burke in 1894 and then of Colston right beside it in 1895. Will Burke fall as well? I'll leave it for others to decide. Now, there's no merchant statue in Cork, despite much latter-day talk of those merchant princes, whether they're in Montenotte or on in the South Mall, about whom we were hearing yesterday with Mike McCarthy-Morrow. Yet Cork, in terms of its population size, had actually overtaken Bristol by the time Edmund Burke was MP across the way. Both Bristol and Cork were, in the 18th century, great pre-industrial trading centres, Atlantic-facing ports, profoundly shaped by the regulatory framework inside which overseas trade was conducted in the old British Empire. I'm thinking, of course, of the Navigation Act. And in that era, what we quickly call the long 18th century, from the sort of late 1600s to the early 1800s, was an era of sustained trade growth across the Atlantic, an era of recurrent maritime warfare, chiefly between Britain and France. And now we're all aware, if we weren't always aware, that a great central feature of that transatlantic trade was the European seizure and alienation of American land and the European extraction of African labor for the exploitation of that American land and the vast trade in enslaved labor, going back to the 16th century, but primarily from the mid-17th to the early 19th century. That vast trade was partly because of the ill-suitedness of European labor to the physical demands of work in the tropics. And I say that because, in a way, if you look at the dilemma that someone like Burke had about the Caribbean and the slave trade, was, on the one hand, temperamentally opposed to the notion of enslavement and to his conception of liberty. On the other hand, recognizing that to the Britain in which he lived and was celebrated, that the Caribbean and its economy was essential to English, to British power. He, in other words, could not contemplate the cost of upsetting what made the engine work, so to speak. Just a reminder of the Caribbean that we're talking about, which is much of the 18th century issues concern the Eastern Caribbean, the Windward, the Leeward Islands, but of course Jamaica increasingly important from a British point of view, and if we're taking a wider French and European point of view, the French islands, and particularly Saint-Domingue in Hispaniola, the modern Haiti, and then the center of what becomes early 19th century sugar and slavery, the Spanish island of Cuba, which is just off the map. It's interesting that there is actually an Irish dimension, really, from almost the beginning of this story. In other words, there's an argument recently made by colleague David Brown that the prototype slave plantation in the Americas, adopting what had been trialed in the African island of Sao Tome by the Portuguese, in other words, using African coerced labour in the production of sugar, was actually an Irish, indeed a Munster, financed venture in St. Kitts in the 1620s. The names of those involved have a very strong association with these parts. Fane Beecher, and from Cork and Waterford, Anthony Brisket. Now, Brown's claims may not be completely accepted, but it's interesting that, you know, one can see, if you like, these little, very early exploitations marking the way for what was to come in much larger scale from the mid-17th century. There may be a link between some of those early Irish birds, the early folk like Beecher, in St. Kitts and Barbados and Montserrat before the 1641 rising, which helps to explain the particular kind of regional patterns of Irish involvement later. So I'm not really going to talk about, if you like, what has grabbed a lot of attention, namely the notorious extraction of transportees from Ireland in the Cromwellian era, chiefly to Barbados. No, I will come back to that in a few minutes. But that era, the Cromwellian era, the 1650s, really marks the beginning of the 180-year-long cycle of intense commercial exploitation of the English islands in the Caribbean, using predominantly African labour, producing tobacco, coffee, cotton, and of course, increasingly and overwhelmingly, sugar. Part of a wider European cycle of island exploitation in which the Dutch had been very important in the early stages, and in which French involvement becomes, the French role becomes very prominent from the early 1700s, in other words, 1720s and 30s, with the particular growth of the sugar production in Saint-Domingue that I think we'll be hearing about this afternoon from Kate. And a little later still, the role of what happens in Cuba with the Spanish going up to the early 19th century, not to forget the Portuguese slave productions of sugar in coastal Brazil. Now, this story has all sorts of minor Irish, minor Munster, minor Cork kind of hints and wisps of stories. And, there isn't a strong story, certainly not one that has been established. And, we all perhaps learned a long time ago of studying Daniel O'Connell that Ireland could glory in the fact that a slave trade ship had never left these shores. Well, that was a dangerous claim, as we'll see in a few moments, for Daniel O'Connell to have made. But I would just quickly pay to a kind of a gallery of people who over the last, 30 years have been kind of making some attempt to sort of get a narrative here about Irish involvement. Don Akenson with his little book on Montserrat, If the Irish Ruled the World, a rather misleading title. Tom Truxas, who studied Irish-American trade in the 18th century. The great Nini Rogers from Belfast, who's really done the kind of standard book on this. It's a huge book, really. There's 3 or 4 books contained within its covers, published, 15 years ago. More recently, Orla Power, Liam Hogan, David Brown. And then most recently, and perhaps really why I'm standing on this podium today, a book that has come out early this year from Manchester, edited by Fionnuala O'Kane and my colleague Kieran O'Neill, which is at an obscene price, over 100 euros, but will, I hope, if you all sort of rattle your chains, make Manchester produce it in paperback at an affordable price sometime soon. It's a book of essays on various aspects, stretching down to contemporary reflection, but which gathers quite a lot of, if you like, what we know and what we don't know, and it's a big book. Now, if in the broadest terms you plot the growth of Caribbean-led, of the Caribbean sugar-led economy over time. There's no surprise that the sugar trend is very much reflecting the trend in the growth of the transatlantic slave trade itself, in terms of when it peaks and when it begins to level and decline. And you might say another thing that parallels that trend is the city of Cork. The growth from a very small, shattered city in the 1640s to a city that had, as I mentioned, passed that of Bristol, indeed one of the great trading ports in terms of its population, I emphasize that, and which reaches its kind of apogee in Napoleonic times. Here's the view, Robert's view of Cork from early 1790s, looking seawards. Now, at that time, Cork's outward-facing trade patterns were changing up until Robert's view, up to about the 1780s. It was the near continent, to France, to Spain, to Portugal, and of course across the ocean that brought the business to Cork. It is increasingly from that time really trading its exports to across the channel to the burgeoning markets of the south, and particularly the north of England and even to Scotland. So what were these markets that Cork was supplying? Not goods for the slave trade itself, one might say quickly, although it is true that perhaps very early on in the Munster plantation, some of the pig iron being produced, some of the iron coming from the valleys of the Bandon River through the friends and agents of the Earl of Cork, were actually going to Africa as currency in Guinea. That's certainly, I think, happening in the 1630s. But it's quite hard after that to talk about Irish or Cork products that would have been used in the Guinea trade, the African trade itself. It's much more we're talking about what is going westwards. In other words, the beef, the salted beef, the butter, the pork, the tallow, the candles, the hides, some textiles too. This little cartouche, much reproduced, is from Roke's map of Cork, showing, in fact, it's almost the only image we have, contemporary image we have, of the shambles, the slaughtering point, or at least where beef was being prepared for barrelling, salting, and export. For the English islands and further still. Now, we principally think of, if you like, the export of processed animal products. It is worth noting that in the early days of the English islands, quite a lot of horses were sent out from Cork and from, to a lesser extent, from other ports. But the trade in live animals, which seems rather hard to conceive given the time it would have taken to transport them, was certainly there in the late 17th century. But it is very much the standards of what were often referred to as the provisions trade that gave Cork its dominance. Because dominant it was. If you take the exports to continental and Atlantic markets of provisions from Waterford, Limerick, Galway, add them all up, they're still less than half of what was going from Cork through most of the 18th century. One or two other stats. By the middle of the century, over 90% of Jamaica's imports from Ireland were from Cork. And of all the Irish exports dispatched across the Atlantic, over 4/5 of those were going to the Caribbean, not to mainland America, not to South America. The Caribbean is central in what, in the old customs ledgers, was called the plantation exports, but they were really the Caribbean exports. So for whom were these beef and pork and butter and all going? What was the market there? Well, partly for seamen and mariners, partly for Europeans living in the tropical climates, partly for what some would call the Afro-Creoles, free persons of colour who could afford beef and butter and cloth and candles from these parts. But in addition to that, there were certainly goods coming from Cork that were supplies for the enslaved workforce. I'll come back to that point because really we can say all of these important provisions for those travelling and not least provisions for naval vessels in times particularly of war for Europeans living there, for Afro-Creole and for the enslaved workforce. And as far as the English islands are concerned, it is, if you like, the European demand in the islands and the demand from Creole or free persons of colour that was by far the most important. But on the French islands, it was different, particularly in the case of Saint-Domingue, Haiti, where from very early on, from the 1660s, it became established that the planters would, the plantation owners would provide some at least of the provision for their enslaved households. And so there began the tradition in Cork of supplying what became known as French beef, poor quality, scrawny cuts that were sent to the French market for forwarding to Saint-Domingue or to the other islands, Guadeloupe, Martinique, and as in this charming view of Dominica in the 1780s by the artist Agustina Brunias. And the strategic importance of these foodstuffs from Cork became really evident in wartime when you have a kind of scramble by French intermediaries, by merchants who deal with the French trade, trying to find the neutral islands, neutral flags to keep the flow of food moving, both for French naval purposes, but also for the French islands and the French planters, the French enslaved workers. So if Cork's economy was therefore fairly enmeshed with that of the Caribbean, why were there no Edward Colstons? Why have we no statues, or at least former statues, that might have been demolished 100 years ago? Well, the regulatory context here is critical. The Royal Africa Company was a royal monopoly that excluded, well, initially everybody but members, then everybody but English-based merchants, and opened up to the Scots after Anglo-Scottish Union, but never to Irish merchants. Although, yes, we do see suspiciously Irish, suspiciously Cork names in the early history of the Royal Africa Company. There is, for instance, William Ronan, or Ronayne, who clearly was rather important, played an important role in the Jacobite times in the company. And I think that dimension of, if you like, the kind of backdoor role of Irish persons in the Royal African Company has yet to be unpicked. But it is, if you like, the obvious standing point that Irish-based merchants could not directly import from the Caribbean the choice products of, well, particularly of sugar and tobacco. Products from the 1680s, for 100 years, almost exactly 100 years, had to be routed through English, or after 1707, Scottish ports. And as transatlantic trade became more centralized over time, in the sense that opportunities that you might have had a great development of an entrepot trade in somewhere like Cork did not happen. So it's Bristol, it's Liverpool, it's Glasgow in the English and Scottish case, or Nantes in the French case, that become the great hubs, and where places like Cork as an Irish port had a disadvantage, not a huge disadvantage, but a disadvantage in not being able to trade directly. Thus you find, in a sense, the absence of the emergence of big venturing merchants to the Caribbean. And what instead you see is that the Atlantic trade out of Cork was largely conducted on commission. In other words, Cork merchants were taking orders from English or Dutch or French merchants to supply them. Now, this is particularly strongly the case in the case of trade to the English islands. And here let's introduce the new publication by Irish Manuscripts Commission, edited by James O'Shea, which I would commend, the letter book of Cork merchant William Hovell, two L's, a leading Cork merchant in the 1680s. New English is how we would kind of classify him, though he's Kinsale born. Like most of the shippers in the Cork of the 1680s, not all, Protestant, part of a sort of a new business class that had been created in the shambles of the 1640s and early 1650s, many of whom had cousins and connections and brothers or sisters in Bristol and or London. And this letter book, which is a sole surviving kind of business record from 17th century Cork, I think we can say, comes at a precarious moment for the likes of Hovell, because this is just as James II's Catholicization policy of public service and the army is taking effect. And you can see in the letters Hovell is understandably somewhat uncertain. Indeed, he has to decamp just after the end of this letter book in 1688, returns, of course, to early Williamite Cork, 1690, I think it is, and indeed becomes briefly mayor of the city. But staying on the era of the letter book, it's quite evident he was a commission merchant primarily, although still doing a little bit of his own venturing, meaning taking risk in sending ships to places like Antigua and Barbados, beef and butter for sugar and tobacco in return, is very, very much put out by the fact of the tightening up of the Navigation Acts, preventing direct import from these islands after 1685. But nevertheless, still very much in business until politics sort of intervenes, and then, of course, it's war. We do have a statue. Well, we do have, I think we can call it part of a very fine tomb. Some of you will know who know your Cork City well in what was St. Peter's Church. Sir Matthew Dean, who would have been Hovell's senior, rising in the world when Hovell was writing his letters to his friends in London. Those giving him commission complaining about, what a bad guy Dean was. Dean had been a merchant probably for 25 years by that stage. I've no direct evidence that he was engaged in the Caribbean, but it seems almost impossible that he wasn't involved. But he was kind of withdrawing from trade by the time of the Hovell letter book and becoming a purchaser of land in particularly in North Cork. But you see Hovell talking about Dean, for objectionable individual for his extreme litigiousness and oppression. He has grown so abominable, says Hovell to his London friend. Dean, we can assume, didn't have a great admiration for Hovell, but there we are. Hovell had, from his evidence of his letters, an intimate knowledge of the Atlantic and talks about trade to Barbados and Antigua as the old trade. And in one letter, near the very end of the published volume, he says to his apprentice, who's sent out as a supercargo, if you are at a loss when you're in Barbados, you're going up to Antigua, yes, perhaps get some Africans to trade up to Antigua. So Hovell is potentially involved in enslaving, or rather his agent is, his supercargo is. But like so many big Cork merchants, then and later, Hovell and Dean invested not in Caribbean speculation, but in the very fluid and potentially very profitable land market on their doorstep in this county and parts adjacent. We have to remember, venturing at home was much, it seemed at least, at much lesser risk than venturing far afield, unless you were a younger son of a younger son. Atlantic commission trading and venturing to the near continent, in other words, trade to Nantes and Bordeaux, to Lisbon and Cadiz, that is different. And there you do see much more, if you like, shipping that's Cork-owned involved in that through the next century, through the 18th century. But on the question that I suspect is sort of there in the back of most people's minds this morning, well, was Cork involved in the slave trade itself? Is he saying not at all, or perhaps a little, or is it hidden? Well, what I'm really saying is we're not quite sure. I mean, where you start with is this wonderful, I'm giving it official title, the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, which is an online resource, one of the earliest great historical databases created by initially David Richardson, a great historian who died only last month. The Transatlantic Database documents something like 36,000 voyages that carried enslaved persons from Africa across the Atlantic. And if we are to believe the database, well, we're not encouraged to take it as gospel, but if we take it as gospel, only 7 voyages that appear to have begun in Cork carrying slaves during the 18th century are recorded. In fact, there are certainly some more than that, but not many, because of the regulatory restrictions involved on the British side. Where you will, of course, find the story is by looking at Cork expatriates on the continent. We'll come back to that point in a few moments. But I want to stay with just, if you like, Cork merchants or other Cork families involved in the British flagged slave trade. And we can find some evidence. I mean, there's a curious little spike, the late 1740s, early 1750s, when there's 4 voyages coming out from Cork, 2 of which are on the database, 2 of which are not, under the captaincy of one Henry Fitzgerald. I think the vessel is called the Elizabeth, going to places like Cape Verde, certainly involved in some slave capture or slave purchase and slave trading, coming back then across the Atlantic to Cork from Philadelphia. I know nothing about Henry Fitzgerald. I've tried, but I'm sure somehow we will build a bigger story on that one. Then there are the other people of Cork birth or Munster birth and origin who are based in Bristol or Liverpool. I mean, there's a William Barry and a Michael Callaghan in Bristol who are medium-scale slave traders in the 1720s and 30s. Or in Liverpool, rather better known, from Kerry, but with Cork connections, David Toohey. Between 1759-72 was a slaving captain involved in 4 voyages, and in the latter part of his career from 1772 to his death in 1788 was a co-partner living in Liverpool in African voyages and transatlantic voyages. Also very much involved in trading back home to Cork and to Dingle and to even trying to send salt to Tralee by sea. Now, who was David Toohey? Well, as I say, a small collection of his papers has been known about for quite a long time in Liverpool. But the whole story, I don't think had been quite worked out. His father-in-law was one Philip Nagle, almost certainly from Cork, who was based in Liverpool and had been a sea captain on the so-called African or the Guinea trade. And Toohey himself brings out his Tralee nephew, Edward Toohey, to help him. And the Toohey papers have a letter from David Toohey's nephew back to the parents in Kerry. I don't expect you to be able to read that except even in the front row, so I'll just read a little bit from it. This is written from Edward Toohey, May 72, to his father in Tralee. I'm preparing to go a voyage to Old Calabar, Africa, on the Kitty, Captain Grimshaw, and expect to be out in 8 or 10 days. I left school on the 10th of this month after going through arithmetic, navigation, and bookkeeping. I expect to be out from Liverpool no longer than 8 or 9 months, as I'm going on a trader for another ship. As I'm going on a tender for another ship, which makes the time shorter than if we were to be slavers there ourselves. This is a vessel my uncle is concerned in, and as he is not determined to go on the voyage, I take this opportunity of going. I'm kind of highlighting this for several reasons. First of all, there's a very young 18 or 19-year-old going out a slaving from a Kerry background. The second reason I'm highlighting it is because that Edward Toohey was the uncle of Daniel O'Connell's wife, Mary. So, and indeed you could argue that Mary O'Connell's grandfather is David Toohey, who was training up this lad to go a slaving in Africa. But I'm also highlighting because that young fellow telling his parents about his education went out then to the Caribbean after spending presumably a few weeks in the African coast and sails back on the vessel from Dominica, which is wrecked outside the Mersey. Edward is drowned the following spring, and there's hardly a notice of the fact even in the Liverpool newspapers. This was a business that was certainly known to be dangerous, known to be high risk, and it did attract those perhaps who had fewer options of making a safe fortune at home. Edward Toohey can hardly have been 20 by the time he was drowned. And interestingly, his uncle writes back to Kerry saying, I've been out every day searching the beaches for his body. We've had masses said for him. Well, the wealth and scale of Cork merchants was far greater than the likes of Edward Toohey in Liverpool, despite his slaving trade. He's of modest status in Liverpool. But come back to Cork, come back to another letterbook that has been edited was a decade ago by our same author. And it's very interesting to compare. This is the letterbook of Richard Hare, almost the same year as Toohey was making that expedition to Africa and Dominica. And we have in this letterbook, Richard Hare's letterbook in the early 70s, insight into Cork at the peak of its Atlantic trading. And Hare himself was very much the leader of the pack. Unlike Hovell, no sense of venturing independently to the Caribbean. Little direct contact, indeed, with the Caribbean. He's corresponding with over 200 traders and merchants in Ireland and in Britain, a few in Holland and in France. But it's all, if you like, business that he is servicing the needs of others. But he had great leverage, controlling over supply lines, control over credit, squeezing smaller players locally, and a man of great substance in the Cork scheme of things, and even in the period of this letterbook, buying land in his own hinterland, becoming a major North Kerry landowner, the man who becomes owner of the area right around Listowel, from buying up the old Earl of Kerry's estates, building a great property on the Blackwater, becomes Convermore. He is the ancestor of the Earls of Listowel. So what's interesting there really is you can see somebody who is not directly involved at all in the Caribbean, yet is most certainly somebody who, over a successful, long career, built up a fortune in servicing the Atlantic trades. On a similar theme, we all like Beamish and Crawford. And forget perhaps that Beamish and Crawford was a merchant house, and even long after the great Porter Brewery had been built in the 1790s, well, this is 1812, a bill of lading from Cork for Beamish and Cork, sending out small amounts of, I think, beef and butter and pork to Jamaica on somebody else's vessel. Okay, let's reverse the perspective and say, what is the footprint in the Caribbean of Cork-originated folk? And I'll do this fairly quickly. I mean, the 1650s deportations that I mentioned at the beginning to Barbados is a hugely important episode, of course, but it is a very short-lived episode. And what is much more difficult is what happened to the descendants of those who were coerced across the Atlantic. They certainly scattered. A great many died very early on. But insofar as we can judge from surnames in Montserrat, in Barbados, in the islands in the Eastern Caribbean, there aren't that many Cork names compared to the names of Galway, Limerick, Tipperary names. The surname evidence certainly confirms the impression we have that a lot of those Cromwellian deportees, despite the role of Brachel the Orrery, despite the fact that Kinsale and Cork Harbour is used for these extraordinary events during the Cromwellian period, that it isn't primarily Cork folk who are the victims involved. So what other groups should we be looking for? Well, let's take the traders who are in transit, the likes of Hovell's apprentice who goes out in the 1680s, the supercargo, or the folks who spend a few years in Kingston or in Bridgetown or wherever, who are, in a sense, acting for their uncles back in Ireland, which you would expect to find a little bit of, certainly early on. But Cork names don't predominate, even by Irish standards, in places like Kingston. There are, yes, one or two firms that have Cork, direct Cork links, like the Curtains and in Montserrat, the trader of some importance, Patrick Gould. These are, I would agree, rarities by comparison. Then what about those who got a little further embedded? The plantation overseers, the agents, even the owners of slaves and land. Again, it's more Galway and Limerick that is the origin important. And in the late 18th century, West Ulster, Derry, Donegal names begin to become more prominent, particularly in parts of Jamaica and in Demerara, in the kind of new areas in the Ceded Islands in the southeast of the Caribbean. But the sort of people that in the 18th century just occasionally come across are, well, let me be mischievous again and say Daniel O'Connell's cousin, John Burke. Again, I think from Tralee, but I may be wrong, but certainly a Kerryman who went out as an overseer, then becomes a plantation owner, not a big one, but a plantation owner, an owner of enslaved labour, and in the 1790s is sending some money, not a lot, back home, and it's reflected in the O'Connell papers. Then you have what sometimes they call the kind of sojourners, the mariners, the craftsmen, the women of Irish background who you find in the towns. Very hard to document, except when they get into trouble. But I think one obvious point is that given the vast numbers of vessels calling at Cork, calling at least at Cove, and taking several weeks to lade their goods for the Caribbean, there were the opportunities to get on board, to be hired when there's a shortage of crew. There's a lot of people who must have had some experience of the run westwards, who may have stayed or not necessarily chosen to stay, but have been forced to stay in the West. One would assume, and I say it's very hard to document, I certainly haven't seen anything to kind of quantify this, that you would get a certain amount of migration that way. There is certainly a sense of that in Jamaica in the second quarter of the 18th century, but a lot of such people will have been very mobile and are as likely then to turn up in the likes of Charleston or Philadelphia or Baltimore or wherever. And then there are what I rather grandly would call the trans-imperial migrants, those who moved 2 steps from home base, the sons of families who settled initially in La Rochelle or in Nantes or Bordeaux or the Spanish ports, would come out maybe in the 17th century, but just as likely had come out because their fathers and their grandfathers had sort of marked the way into a European port setting. And, you know, this is particularly true, it's been very well documented, for Cadiz, where you have waterford migration going on there, generation after generation after generation, beginning in the bad times, beginning in the 1640s, but continuing right up to the end of the 18th century. And the size of that Waterford colony in Cadiz is really larger than anything that Cork could boast of on the continent, even in Bordeaux. Well, my point is, in such a colony, you will find some who will naturally travel west and stay west. And that's certainly the case, for example, in the case of Cornelius Coppinger, who was for a period in Malaga and then ends up during the short period of British control of Cuba in Havana at the end of the 1750s, stays there, passes back into Spanish control, and is a very important figure in the early history of slaving between Jamaica and Cuba. Cornelius Coppinger becomes a dominant figure in that trade, which hasn't been particularly well studied. But I want to kind of sorry to deprive you of that image for a moment, but just to sort of spend a few minutes before I finish on the island of Antigua. Huge island in terms of its sugar production, small island in its geography. Very important from 18th century Cork folk because it became the great source of Caribbean rum. And that certainly tradition survived into the era when Cork began to be a great centre of distilling. And one of the things you see in the business archives of the Cork distillers is the attempt to try and mimic Antigua rum. But they don't tell you that. Anyway, Antigua is important for all sorts of reasons. It was the centre for British naval presence in the Caribbean. The dockyard there associated, of course, latterly with Horatio Nelson. It has a vicious history in terms of suppression of slave revolt, in which Irish names are certainly involved, not Cork names perhaps. But it's interesting that, you know, it's an island in which you sense this kind of a Cork presence, and yet it's very hard to pick it precisely. I mean, for instance, the Martin family, no connection with the Martins we were hearing about yesterday afternoon from McCarthy Morrow. I don't think so. But there's a famous Antiguan Martin, Samuel Martin, who becomes, as we call the Arthur Young of the Caribbean. You know, somebody who believed in enlightened principles for sugar production and wanted, in a sense, to make the life of his enslaved population more tolerable. Big deal. But I mean, he is trying to apply principles of economy to the slave sugar economy, and his connections with Edmund Burke are rather interesting, by the way. But he has his family is of Irish background. I'm not sure if it's Munster or Ulster, but what is interesting is that there's a very large archive from Samuel Martin in the British Library, which is really documenting, among other things, his role as a big planter who is dealing directly with Cork merchants, importing what he needs for his estate, and indeed getting some slave goods as well, as in the 1750s and 60s. And that Martin archive has not been fully exploited. But it's his grandson, I think, yes, who marries into a Cork family, and there's a sort of hint that they have Cork connections that I have not been able to pin down more. But the Martins of Antigua were a really very big deal. One member of the family is an Attorney General, and old Samuel Martin, who lived to a great age, dies about 1777, known as the father of Antigua, with Irish links. But anyway, on Antigua, let's just focus on this little puzzle. Those of you with really 2020 vision will see this was published in Cork in 1789, and we don't know who S.K. was. I don't think it's Simon Kingston, but I have tried hard. Probably Simon will not want it to be associated, but let me see. This is a Cork migrant who went out in 1774 to manage the Chief Justice's plantation, Chief Justice Blizzard, up in the north of the island, and he had 15 years of experience there in St. George's Parish, returns to Cork and writes this pamphlet, which gives you kind of granular detail of everyday life in Antigua, diet, dress, work patterns, maternity provision, etc. It is, trying to defend the rationality of the system there while attacking, if you like, bad plantation owners. It's a kind of classic type of literature, but it's particularly, if you like, specific in detail. And what's interesting, why did this come out in Cork? Well, apart from the fact that he clearly had Cork connections, what was the market? 1789. Well, obviously, it's linked to something going on in the debates of the taverns and the coffee houses of Cork. There is a growth of abolitionist sentiment in the city, evident in the press in the 1780s and in what we might call the local public sphere. You have also the publication 2 years after that, at least I think it's 1791, of what's the only Irish printing of a kind of single sheet ballad by William Cooper, The Negro's Lament, which was very much an important piece of polemic used in the abolitionist movement. So what was behind that, I'm not sure, but here we have two pieces of print which are not appearing anywhere else. And we know at the same time, I think it's 1788, it began a move by a very powerful Cork merchant, Cooper Penrose, the man whose name survives in Penrose Quay, Cooper Penrose, to get the Cork, what would become the Chamber of Commerce, the Committee of Merchants, to support a petition opposing the slave trade. Now, such a petition was brought to the Dublin Chamber and passed, pushed by its Quaker merchants. In Cork, it didn't happen. In Cork, despite Penrose's power and, no doubt, advocacy, it didn't happen. Maybe thanks to SK's sort of complications or other complicating the story, it didn't happen. But it would be wrong to say, well, that was it, because it wasn't. I mean, you do see in the next decade, the 1790s, that in Cork there is an awareness more than ever of the Caribbean, not least, of course, because of the uprising in Saint-Domingue and the extraordinary ending of the slave system on the French island. And particularly Dennis Driscoll's paper, rather eccentric paper, the Cork Gazette, comes back to this again and again. And you get a hint of this ferment. I don't want to play it up, but it's in the atmosphere. A hint of this ferment in 1795 with a short-lived mutiny in the city centre, Grand Parade, by troops awaiting embarkation to Saint-Domingue, a British regiment being brought out to that, as they thought, hellhole for yellow fever and everything else. And there was a mutiny, and some of the mutineers appealed for public support, rhetorically asking, quote, "You unfortunate and enslaved natives of Africa, are you to feel our steel?" I'm not sure how this was to appeal to a Cork audience or spectators. We don't know what happened. All we know is that this is a strange moment, but it is nevertheless one where you get these sort of hints that there was an alternative, some narrative being built. So to finish, I mean, we're left, I think, wondering why there is, apart from those things, so little direct reflection of how far Cork's economy had facilitated slavery production over a crucial period. In other words, go back to my first thing about absence and presence and sort of a half awareness. I mean, did Daniel O'Connell know that his wife's uncle had been a slaver? Did he know that his cousin was sending money back from Jamaican plantation? One suspects he did, but perhaps he didn't rate it as very important. Another question, I suppose, is what if there had been no Cork beef or butter or candles or herring for the Caribbean? Would this have mattered? It certainly would have changed the equation. Who would have been the gainers? Who would have been the losers? Well, it certainly would have made sugar a great deal more expensive. But I suppose a much bigger question is, what if there had been no Royal African Company, no initial trade in the great transatlantic slave trade? How would that have affected Africa? But how would that have affected Ireland, Munster, Cork? With such questions, I leave it hanging, and a nice image that implies a degree of equanimity. I should say that the leader of the Haitian Revolution, Toussaint Louverture, loved the work of this artist, Agostino Brunias, even though a lot would see that his work is not as transgressive as perhaps Toussaint Louverture thought. But I leave that image just for a moment on the screen. Thank you.
David, thank you. Just for those of you who are wondering, I can confirm I'm not the author of a late 18th century tract on the... others may know who is. David, would you be happy to take one or two questions in the time we have, and maybe sometime later too? Questions for David?
David, thanks for a wonderful paper. In response to your focus on the slave trade, so to speak, the transatlantic slave trade, another focus that could maybe yield insight here more directly would be the question of capital investment in plantations in the West Indies. So I'd like to probe your big knowledge of all these families and their capital investments. How much capital investment was there from Cork in plantations, and indeed, more broadly, Irish investment in plantations across the West Indies? So that's my leading question. But maybe this is more than a point, more about the Irish diaspora, which has been written up as an entirely white story, if you read the standard books on the Irish diaspora. And of course, much has been left out of this Caribbean connection, the Caribbean Irish names that you touched upon, and indeed many of the Black American Irish who've largely been left out of the story, which we kind of woke up to slightly when Barack Obama rocked up here some years ago. And suddenly we were celebrating something that we hadn't even thought about. So that's the point I'd like to make.
Thanks, Andy. I think on the first question about, if you like, Irish investment, and I use the word Irish rather than Cork, Irish investment in the areas of the Caribbean which are associated with the slave system. I mean, the great UCL project looking at slave compensation has been enormously revealing. And we have a kind of an updated report on the UCL database as far as it relates to Ireland in the book that I was waving around earlier. I mean, it's still proportionally much smaller than Scotland and much, much smaller proportionally than England, but it's there. And the way I think what's interesting is to look at it partly in terms of region, partly from an Irish perspective, partly in terms of Irish region, and also looking at it in terms of periodization, because in the kind of era that I've been taking a very sort of broad sweep over 150 years, I mean, there's very limited Irish and certainly extremely limited Cork investment in the British Islands in that time. But you can see that changing in the last sort of sub-period. In other words, from the Napoleonic times up to the 1830s, it is changing, and it's perhaps more changing if you look at Ulster rather than Munster. And when you look at some of these huge compensations that were discovered in the UCL project, it's Ulster names that we're not really very familiar with, who are important. But a great deal of those who are in fact compensated are the nieces, or at least the kin of people who were physically out there. So it's quite a difficult job to unpick what was happening. So that's the first point. I think that the level of direct investment, compared, say, to almost any region you might take of Scotland, is small in the English-flagged islands. If, however, one is talking about the Caribbean more broadly, it's a very different story. And since I think we may be hearing a bit more about Saint-Domingue this afternoon. I mean, there you do find families of Kilkenny, of Waterford, of Dublin, and Cork ancestry who've who've associated particularly with the French world, particularly with Nantes, who are extremely important, not least in Saint-Domingue. And there, if you're looking for Irish plantation owners and all the horrors that went with that, that's probably the place to start. But that does mean that one sort of ignores the role of an awful lot of, if you like, non-land owning, if you like, capital carrying people who passed through the Caribbean, women as well as men, who we know about. And I think those of you who are interested in Nana Nagle will know that there's a tantalizing little reference in her correspondence that the Order have published about her wishing to send out some children from Cork City to help the education of the unidentified poor blacks. One suspects it may be in Saint-Croix, possibly in one of the French islands. It's not specified, but I mean, that kind of hidden movement, I'm sure, is important, but the kind of movement of major resources of investment would only, I think, come if you had more direct Cork investment in the trade, in the way that you are seeing there in the 17th century. And that is kind of pushed aside by the effects of the Navigation Acts. But I mean, I'm not saying poor Cork, because in a sense, there's an awful lot of other outlets for investment and, if you like, the makings of the likes of Richard Hare on home ground that didn't involve West Indian links directly, but of course, indirectly, without the Caribbean, what a different world it would have been. As to go back to Edmund Burke, he was the first to see, it's a terrible story, but can we do without it?
You mentioned Cork, you mentioned Limerick and Galway, as Limerick, of course, is part of Munster as well. And I'm aware of Catholic priests from the Diocese of Limerick going to Jamaica in the 1830s, one of them being Butler, who later became Bishop of Diocese of Limerick. Do you have any comments, observations on the Limerick connection with slave trade?
Thank you. I mean, I'm trying to stay South Munster-ish, but you're absolutely right. I mean, the Limerick is disproportionately associated with a whole lot of things in both the English islands and in the French islands. And it goes back very early. It goes back to before 1641. And I mean, if one wanted, in a very simple way to say, well, in a sense, Cork was much better placed to play this kind of service role in the Atlantic. Limerick had to work harder to get its slice of cake. But I mean, it's also, I think, relevant that there's a much stronger association between a number of Dutch merchants and Limerick very early on. And that Dutch-Limerick connection, I think, is the explanation for some of the early Limerick associations with the Caribbean. And in a sense, once there, you get kind of family tradition of movement and knowledge, and it builds and builds. Now, I wouldn't exaggerate the Limerick connection. I think in many ways, the most surprising one is the role of Galway families particularly in places like, on the one hand, Barbados and Antigua, but also across in Jamaica. And again, you have to go back to the 17th century to see why it began that way. And once, in a sense, the tradition had begun, there was a certain momentum established, mainly associated with those the tribes of Galway families, the old families that survived thanks to the treaty articles of 1691. But that's another story.
Can I ask you all to thank David Dickson again for that fascinating talk?